I'm with Jawed Ashraf, one of India's finest diplomats, retired from the Indian Foreign Service. Ambassador Ashraf was India's ambassador to France, High Commissioner to Singapore, worked in the Prime Minister's office, both with Dr. Manmohan Singh, the former Prime Minister, as well as with Prime Minister Narendra Modi, a long 5-year span that overlapped both governments. He has also served in the US and has handled the India-US relationship critically over several years, both in Delhi as well as in Washington, D.C. I'm Jyoti Malhotra with the Tribune. I'm in Chandigarh and Ambassador Jawed Ashraf is in Delhi. Welcome, Ambassador, to the Tribune.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me, Jyoti.
So my first question, of course, is about the mother of all summits. We've had the US President Donald Trump meeting with the Ukrainian President Zelenskyy overnight in the US, in Washington, D.C. But what was so interesting, I think, for all of us who follow world affairs is that this whole galaxy of European leaders, so many heads of state, Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, Giorgia Meloni, the prime minister of Italy, and so many other leaders from Germany, NATO, across Europe were all there, also at the White House, as if shoring up Zelensky and sort of supporting him from behind, as it were, metaphorically, of course. We've had President Trump say to the world that hopefully there will be an end to the 3-year-long Russia-Ukraine war. 4 days ago, the two leaders, Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, and Trump met in Alaska. But first of all, to you, Ambassador Ashraf, what does this mean for the world? And more importantly, what does this mean for India?
Well, first of all, I think, this is the two legs of this summit tree. One is, of course, in Anchorage, and when President Putin and President Trump met. I think, and then we've seen this extraordinary sight, President Zelenskyy in suit in the White House.
Yes, absolutely.
And 8 European leaders pulled out of their summer vacation, their cherished August summer vacations, all over the place, and they rushed to Washington, D.C. I think for both to bolster President Zelensky's, but also to try and persuade President Trump that European interests could not be sacrificed sensibly just because we need an end to the war. Because their argument would be that this is going to be a chimera, we have peace for a short while, and things could explode again. But I think the first question that we really see is, peace may be possible, but peace seems always possible till you get into the details. And we don't know the details yet.
Right.
So, and for President Putin, given President Trump's stance, one complete abandonment of principle, which is actually an honest position, considering US has never actually been a
Who
country
is abandoning the principle?
Well, President Trump is saying, you got to make compromise because he's more powerful. He's sitting on your territory. You're not going to be able to fight him. Now, since at least the post Second World War, we have been living with this fundamental international architecture or framework in which there is supposed to be the inviolability of territorial integrity and sovereignty, and that use of force cannot be permitted, etc. However, we all know that the United States and others have often violated it while paying lip service to these. So in some sense, I'd argue that, President Trump is stating an obvious fact that those who have the power will exercise it in their interest.
And you're talking really about the Russian President Putin in February of 2022 when he marched into Ukraine and has a large...
So the thing is that, of course, that's the history of this goes back to 2007-8 when the United States said under President Bush in that unipolar moment that they're going to invite Ukraine and Georgia to be members of NATO. I mean, I think that was a real red flag, which completely shifted Russian and President Putin's position, and that has never been the same again. So in some sense, it's a US president which is trying to bring an end to that conflict, which really began in 2007-8 and has continued until now. I think President Putin senses that this is his best moment to extract the best possible deal.
Right.
And that is in terms of territorial concessions. That means, 20% of Ukrainian territory. He will probably get absolute assurance that no NATO membership. We don't know. I think we will probably see the end of President Zelenskyy in an election after this, protection of the Russians, and the security guarantees would be something which will be a subject of great debate between the two sides. I mean, will it be verbal assurances, which will be written treaties? What would be the nature of forces that would be allowed for Ukraine and for Europeans to station there?
Mhm.
What would be the agreement on territory? It will be de jure or de facto. Would it be Russia occupied Ukrainian territory, as we say in the case of Korea or in the case of Jammu and Kashmir?
Right.
Or will it be actually a de jure? I mean, that would mean absolute a treaty where the territory is ceded. All of these details are yet to be worked out. But I think at this point of time, we are closer than before. I think there is realism in Europe also that there is a need for some kind of a face-saving, relatively, acceptable agreement
Yeah.
to bring about a peace. Now, ceasefire is out of the question. Now we are
Yeah.
talking straight about peace. And in a sense that they would also recognize there has to be something that ensures European security or a Eurasian security in the long run. What
Okay.
does it mean first of all, for the world? What does it mean for Europe? And what does it mean for
For
India?
India,
In
absolutely. Yeah.
yeah. So
So
let me
just a quick
start by
question.
you.
Yeah, so just sorry to interrupt you, Ambassador, but just a quick question. The India question, which I know that every Indian viewer of this Tribune platform, and I know that many have been asking you the same question. Just a couple of days ago, the U.S. trade counselor in the administration, in Trump's administration, close to the U.S., Peter Navarro, wrote an article in the Financial Times. I hope I'm not jumping the gun by asking you about the India question. But he said India's oil lobby is funding Putin's war machine, the war machine in Ukraine, and that has to stop. And he went on with some other uncomplimentary words. So how would you connect for us the India buying all supplies from the Russians and the Americans accusing India and sanctioning India for buying those oil supplies?
First of all, I think this is a manifestation of some sort of a deeper anger, rage. It's something for psychologists to study.
Why? Why? Tell
Um,
us why.
Oh, I think, I've answered this question. One, of course, is the perception that President Trump has that, he has been absolutely looking for countries and for leaders to, in a sense, capitulate, genuflect before him, revalidate to his audience and to him consistently that he is the supreme power in the world, that kind that world hasn't seen. Now, there are very few countries actually that have been able to stand up
Mhm.
to it. Russia has been one of them.
Okay.
China is the other. India is one. Brazil are the others. Everyone else has struck deals which are highly asymmetric
Mhm.
and which are absolutely one-sided, which gives the sense of a tribute being paid to a president monarch. You
So
look
Prime
at the
Minister
U.
Modi has refused to do that? He has refused
Yes,
to
Prime Minister has refused to do it, but he hasn't been got involved in a confrontational war of words. I think our position has been principled, it has been restrained, but it is open and flexible, ready for open to negotiations. So I think that's one part of it, and some of it is the rage and things coming out of what he perceives of his role in bringing about an India-Pakistan conflict, cessation of India-Pakistan conflict, for which he feels we are not giving him credit.
So
And it
should
is
you
something that
should
has
you give
gotten
him
deeply.
should you give him more credit, Ambassador Ashraf? What do you think?
Look, I'm not involved in this process at all, but from my historical experiences, I mean, of having dealt with this India-US relations in the context of Pakistan, that it really, we don't usually allow others to come in and determine the course of this. Now,
Mhm.
if there have been reports, see, he wasn't directly involved in this process, right?
Right.
He got a feedback from Vice President Vance, and he got a feedback from Secretary of State and National Security Advisor Marco Rubio. What they told him about their conversations may have shaped his thinking, and
Mhm.
but that may be very different from the reality, and maybe very different and maybe based on their interpretation of the conversation. So I can't get into that issue, but quite clearly. if we have been so consistently clear in our position, there has to be a basis for it. I mean, we're not staking out a whole relationship only for this bit.
Mhm.
Now, having said this, and you know that Pakistan plays this US ego and vanity across every administration in a way that makes them feel much obliged to Pakistan, and they also play the role of the compliant rogue that is able to address their problems in the region. That apart, so I think whatever it is, this coupled with, because I don't think that trade is the real issue or the Russian oil is the issue. If that Russian oil was the issue, what about the initial sanctions that EU had
Mhm.
allowed for Russian gas to flow through pipeline into some of the countries in East Europe that needed it, right?
Mhm.
Because they couldn't switch. LNG imports continue. In the case of Turkey and China, the imports are very high. The point I'm making here is that all of this is a way to, sort of a stick against us for a sense of, anger, irritation, etc., towards us. So, and it is highly political. If Stephen Miller, who's the deputy chief of staff, talks about it,
Mhm.
it's a MAGA person. I mean, chiefs of staff and deputy chiefs of staff don't talk about these foreign policy issues. He's gotten waded into it again about the Russian oil. Now, here's a US president who, even before a deal is struck, even before he knows what President Putin has to offer, has US aircraft escorting him in, has this red carpet out for him, allows him to speak first, which is against diplomatic norms,
Mhm.
conveys the level of respect, awe, and admiration even before he struck a deal. It clearly shows that President Trump is not driven by values but by power. He only respects power. He only respects when there is a leverage on the other side. And you see that with China. The moment China exercised that leverage on trade and critical minerals, I mean, there has been a complete change of tone. You don't hear him and his entire retinue of hangers-on and cabinet members and his team berating China on purchase of oil or Turkey, which is a NATO member and strategically
So,
important
so explain
for
that to
them
us then,
to.
Ambassador Ashraf, which is that, you just said that Russia, China, India, and Brazil are the four
Brazil.
countries that have, in a manner, stood up to President Trump
Yes.
and Prime Minister Modi amongst them, refusing to pay tribute to the American president. But having said that, you're also just saying that the Chinese stood up to the Americans, but the Americans have not imposed the kind of sanctions on China
So
like
I was saying that that's what I'm saying,
India.
that we don't have the same kind of economic leverage
Okay.
that China has
Mhm.
in a way to affect American strategic interests. Now, critical minerals or certain, technologies, even certain kinds of electronic equipment, 35% of global manufacturing capacity or value addition is in China. The next 10 countries together account for 37%. So they are able to exercise that leverage and did it very well. That's different. Same with Russia. He sees Russian President Putin as someone who's an embodiment of the kind of power he fancies himself to have. Russia also is got power in terms of their military power that remains, and it is able to exercise it. So if he wants something out of Ukraine, he knows that it will have to be based on what President Putin decides and agrees to. He also realizes that if he goes after President Putin of Russia, it could be something that can be an uncontrolled, unpredictable escalation with consequences that none of us understand. So
Okay.
this is the reality. So having said this,
So,
what happens if there is an agreement between and that, okay, you may get a temporary relief
mhm.
on the Russia oil tariffs, right? That may happen, may not happen. That's a
You
separate
mean India
issue.
could get temporary relief on the Russia oil?
Temporary relief. I
Okay.
I don't think that the argument that is often made that his tariff on India persuaded President Putin to come to the negotiating table. President Putin has been in this business, it's for in his entire life. He's not going to be persuaded by these tactics. So that's one part. So we may get temporary relief. but I don't think it will address the structural problem within the India-US relations. The
Mhm.
second point is that it may if there is peace in Ukraine, which we would all welcome, and I think the government has rightly welcomed this dialogue, will
Yeah,
enable us to, expand the geopolitical space a little bit more than has been the case in the recent past. And as I have written in another piece, that there is a structural shrinking of the geopolitical space
right.
that has also forced some choices on us. Now, apart from that, but think of what else are the consequences.
Mhm.
One is that it conveys the impression of power being the determinant of international relations. Force can be used for territorial expansion or interest, and that could mean something that can happen to Taiwan. It could also mean something that can encourage maybe another major power. I'm saying it's just theoretical possibility
Right.
for China to say, exercise that power vis-a-vis us. There is this collapse of the notion of territorial integrity and sovereignty that it can be dangerous. Another point that worth mentioning here is if there is a genuine rapprochement between Russia and the United States, it would also lead to recalibration of Russia's relationship with us. The level of attention
What
that
does
Russia
that mean?
might be paying. Well, it could mean that Russia's attention towards us may actually diminish. It is possible if there is a peace. I mean, Russia has, suppose, a more peaceful relationship with the United States and with Europe, which I think is not likely to happen. But we'll have to calculate the implications, even as we think that it expands our geopolitical space. Similarly, if you have a US China detente and some sort of a modus vivendi or agreement, you're going to have a similar challenge of dealing with us. What you are seeing is perhaps in Trump's mind, deep down,
Mhm.
the big three. As we used to say the big three in tennis, Nadal and Federer, let me put it in my order of preference, Federer, Nadal, and Djokovic. You have these three, he in his mind, three big powers that can actually
Mhm.
find a way to work together
Mhm.
and shape the world. And he had, remember, spoken once about a G3 summit for disarmament and things.
Mhm.
So all of these things, it doesn't necessarily mean it will happen, but it is for diplomats and for analysts and for policymakers in India. You have to look at all kinds of possibilities arising from it. If
Mhm.
it leads to a perception in China that there will be a no cost really from the United States if they go after Taiwan. As you saw just now during the trade negotiations, the Taiwanese president wasn't allowed to stop.
The,
Then you also have a series of economic consequences on us that can be very dangerous.
so the
So we
G,
are entering.
yeah, so sorry to interrupt you again. So the G3 is potentially a G3 is between the US, Russia, and China. And
Yeah, so
how
I'm
does it
talking
impact
about
you?
the way he approaches the sense of power.
Yeah,
So the way he's approaching China, it
yeah.
may end up in a more hostile relationship if they don't reach an agreement. But I'm saying that the way he's negotiating with China, the way he is negotiating with President Putin, and the way he's treating all his allies, first two countries to get the letter on tariff for Korea and Japan, the two strongest and most enduring pillars
Mhm.
of US presence in the Indo-Pacific. EU, what an unequal agreement. And so I'm saying it's the way, and look at the way he's treating India. I mean, it's also the corrosive language. It's not just the tariffs. It's this kind of vengeful, punitive attitude that, I have to. It's an emotional response, not because not
Emotional
in,
response to India? I mean, what has India done to me? If anything, Prime Minister
yeah,
Modi,
it's like an emotion. I mean,
to
how's
Texas and
no,
did a
it
howdy
is, it
modi
is.
with him and, did upkeep on Trump
That's all in the
Sarkar.
past, and I think that his expectation is, see, in my view, he gets patronizing. He's patronizing to European leaders yesterday, downright patronizing. He
Yes.
can get very patronizing, but the moment it's like a bully, he can be nice to you, but if you start standing up and if you say, "Look, I'm not going to bend before you," that changes the attitude dramatically. So
So a bully
You
in a
look at the.
china shop, shall we say?
So if you see when he talks about a language like dead economy, I mean, you have to really stretch your imagination to use language like that. So
So
I
is
think
it
that
just that India refused to concede that the US or Trump himself had mediated between India and Pakistan during Operation Sindoor? Is that what's getting his goat? Is that what's
So
making?
I think there have been, the and the post strategic communication that happened after
Yeah,
that. I mean, there is the trade related issue. Let's start with that. But let me tell you this, that issues of agriculture, dairy, etc., have been there forever in our
right,
relationship. I
right.
mean, I don't know how many meetings and how many nights I've spent also on poultry, dairy, and rather than on nuclear issues
That's
alone.
right. Yeah.
And the offer we have made so far, the openness we have shown is unprecedented.
What is the
We've
offer
never,
that you've made?
sorry?
What is the offer that you've made?
No, that's something which, but the willingness to look at tariffs in a really big way to exactly the kind of rounds of negotiations we've had in the short span of time, back and forth in Delhi, in Washington, D.C., reflect.
But he
But
wants you to open up your
let me say,
agriculture.
he could have pocketed this. He could have pocketed this and said that I have done in a typical President Trump language, I have opened the Indian market like no previous president has. I've got the tariff king to really come down.
But
And remember,
he wanted you to open agriculture and you're refusing to do that.
no, so I think he could still have lived with it if he didn't want to be in that punitive. There is enough offer in the agriculture. We've done that before also, almonds, etc., which is good for our health as well. So, but the the sudden shift in tone and say we don't have a deal and this is what I'm going to do with India, 25%. And then I'm going to add another 25%. And by the way, if I don't have a deal with Russia, I'm going to increase it further. This is just an expression of rage, anger, etc., and principally driven by the fact that he feels that a country like India, which doesn't have the same kind of power as Russia,
China. Hmm.
material,
As China, perhaps.
how China has, then why is it sort of not acknowledging, paying tribute? Why doesn't it thank us for, saving the two countries from a nuclear war, etc.? I mean, this
And
is.
yet, Ambassador Ashraf, and let me ask you here, and yet there are reports that Prime Minister Modi, when he goes to the UNGA in New York in a few weeks' time, there is the likelihood of Prime Minister Modi and Donald Trump meeting.
So, first of all, we've seen reports also in the government. I'm far from it at the moment
Of course.
that there is no decision on PM going to the UNG. Now, having said this, I think that our approach is not confrontational. Our approach is not to retreat behind our doors. It is that we have remained open to negotiations. We have made sure that we state our position
Mhm.
firmly and clearly. We draw our red lines on sensitive sectors and our sovereign choices. The two are important, the sovereign choices with regard to Russia, but that we are prepared to remain open and ready to negotiate. It is an important relationship. It is,
Right.
I mean, consequential also for our national transformation. There is no reason to go down a downward spiral of confrontation. We were at the similar fork in 98, although I don't want to draw any analogy with that. That was a different
98 meaning the
situation.
nuclear tests, the time of the
Yes,
nuclear
but
tests.
but
Okay.
the lessons that we can draw from it are there. There are lessons to be drawn. That time we redefined the terms and the framework of the relationship. We started, I mean, there was a fork we could have taken in the road. You could have taken one way, which was hostility, the other was engagement. We took the path of engagement. Then we redefined the terms of engagement, which led to eventually a strategic partnership. Now, it may be a moment for us to both look inwards, see our own economic policies, but I think also to engage with the US. They would also realize that at some point that India is not going to bend when it comes to its sovereign choices or its interests. We had a similar situation under President Obama with Iranian oil. I
Mhm.
was then I tell you, we told them very simply, you tell us not to buy Iranian oil, we will stand in the parliament and affirm our right to buy Iranian oil. And we did find a way around it, despite all their sanctions, by fencing UCO Bank, and it carried on for some time. So
Yeah.
I think on that particular issue, maybe it will take some time for them to realize that there is no point in destroying a relationship that has been built over 25 years. It serves nobody's interest, in neither the US nor India's, and that we need to accept there are certain red lines. As I told you, I've said that before. One of the challenges for US is about this ally adversary dichotomy. How do you deal with a country that is strategically autonomous and has a very independent DNA? So that is some of the other administrations were finding a way to deal with it. I think as the fissures were there during the Biden administration era, but
Mhm.
because of the overriding concern on China, they were papered over because the US then followed its traditional strategy of relying on alliances. This this president does not believe in dealing with China through alliances, directly dealing with them and finding solutions. And with each of its allies or partners, it is about perceived grievances and extractive possibilities.
Right.
So there is independent tracks, and therefore we are in a somewhat different situation. And I think diplomacy is really about continuously evolving and adapting to changing situations. And I think we will continue to do that. And I think by avoiding getting into muscle flexing confrontational posture, by keeping our heads cool and by remaining open to negotiations, we're doing the right thing while drawing a clear red line on our sovereign choices and our sensitive sectors of trade.
So last couple of questions, Ambassador. This phrase that you just used on sovereign choices, what does that mean? Does that mean that you're going to continue to buy oil from Russia?
I think that that there is see again there we will, as a matter of policy, not prohibit or restrict anybody from buying Russian oil.
Mhm.
That is very clear.
Okay.
What if it becomes difficult to buy Russian oil for whatever reasons? Suppose there is a suppose this whole peace process with over Ukraine breaks down,
Mhm.
and President Trump gets vengeful and decides to be punitive towards Russia. Leaving aside military means, he will use economic
Mhm.
weapons. And suppose he continues to pursue sanctions, and those sanctions can be in different forms. You block off insurance, you block off shipping, you block off financial transactions, use of euro or the dollar markets for transactions, etc. There all kinds of possibilities exist. And therefore, at that stage, what are we going to do? We maybe end up in a technically or commercially, operationally difficult situation with regard to import of oils,
Mhm.
how oil and the crude oil from Russia. But as a matter of policy, I do not think that uh, this will be the position that we will say, okay, to appease President in Washington, D.C., we will break off relations with here. The geopolitical consequences for India will be very severe, not just in our own continental and maritime neighborhood. And I want to emphasize the continental neighborhood, which includes the Eurasia
Right.
and all the way to China, etc. So that could have serious geopolitical consequences. You have to always give top priority to your immediate extended neighborhood because that's what matters the most. There will be consequences for that. There will also be a diminution of India's position in the world. It is its posture, and there will also be domestic political costs for the government if it were to do this. So
Right.
geopolitical, economic, and domestic costs will be there. I don't see that happening.
Ambassador Ashraf, this has been really a masterclass in Indian diplomacy and your connection of the Trump-Zelenskyy Putin summit over two parts in Alaska, in Anchorage, Alaska, as well as then subsequently overnight in Washington, D.C., and what it means for India. And I like your phrase, the use of the phrase sovereign choices. But thank you so much for your time, for talking to us at the
Thank
Tribune.
you. Always a pleasure. Good to see you on screen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you again.